Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, the co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. I'd like to talk a little bit about an issue that we have visited on many times on the website, and that is the discrepancy in wealth distribution. Why do the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? And it looks like it's even getting worse. But an article that we saw, and many others saw too, and had made comments on it, and it appeared in the LA Times, which was a bit of a surprise because the headline more or less says, California is #1 in poverty. Who wants to ever believe that? That's where all the rich people are. That's where Silicon Valley is. And they spend money like it's going out of hand. And they've spent a lot of money on making sure there is no poverty. But now they come up with this statistic. A few people have challenged the statistic on exactly how they measure it. But in general, you know, they're very, very high. And quite possibly they do have the most poverty. But the whole issue of measuring poverty is something else. It's not as easy as it once was. But the statistics are very, very clear about who has most of the wealth in the country. And it's not the lower 50 to 60% of the people. They are living in a much poorer sense than the people in the upper half, or especially in the 1%. Some of those statistics are even hard to believe. But Chris, I'm sure you saw that article, and you've thought about this issue before, about why the rich are so rich and getting richer, and the poor, they just don't seem to be doing very well.
Yes, and we're going to treat these statistics as if it's true, but it is always healthy to have a skeptical eye whenever you get statistics like this, because the nature of government is to always cry for bigger budgets. And you get bigger budgets when you fail. It's like the opposite of the marketplace. When you succeed, you get more money. In government, when things aren't going well, it must mean you need more money. And if people believe that government is there to alleviate poverty, which they shouldn't believe, then they're going to think, well, yeah, give the government more money so that they could alleviate poverty. And it's just a cycle that keeps going on and on. But we're going to treat it as if it's real and talk about the reasons why there's so much poverty.
Well, there's a lot in California, there's a lot everywhere, and there's a lot in the country, but the stock market's high and everybody's supposed to feel very, very good, and there's more optimism. But sometimes that is not the revealing information. I think a couple statistics that have been around that dramatize this, and one of those statistics is that 1% of the rich, the richest 1%, own one half of the wealth in this country. You know, that can stir up some emotions, and if it were all fairly earned, it might be different, but for some reason there's some government mismanagement that helps cause this. And also the top 3 wealthy people in this country, they own as much as the bottom half, 50% of the population. The reason why this is a big concern, it sounds to me that it's unfair, it sounds to me that the government's very much involved, but more importantly, it causes anger. This has happened many times throughout history. The rich get too rich, and they get too authoritarian, and they treat poor people like they're not people anymore, and they don't, and they teach them to be very dependent. And therefore they become less productive, and it just goes on and on. But I think it's the political instability of this maldistribution of wealth that concerns me the most, and that if we think this through, I think it's explainable why the wealth has become you know, poorly distributed throughout a population, because it's been taught in Austrian economics that, you know, the sounder the economy and the sounder the money, the bigger the middle class. But what we're witnessing is the wiping out of the middle class. And Mises said, if you wipe out the value of a currency, you will wipe out the middle class. And I think that's happening. So that's why you hear these great statistics on the economy. And I've always argued people vote, you know, from their bellies on how the economy is doing. So therefore, Trump should be the most popular president ever. But it just turns out that that just might not be true. That maybe that's what we should call the new silent majority. And that is the people out there that are really suffering. But I think they're getting noisier now. They've been silent too long because they didn't understand it. But to me, the most important thing is to understand how this happens and why government is so responsible for the problems we face. And unfortunately, just like in California, they said, yeah, we're in a mess now, and they've spent more money than anybody else, and they want to spend more, even though the statistics show they spent a lot of money on anti-poverty programs, and guess what? They're winning the contest. They have more poverty than anybody else.
Yes, and we mostly on this show talk about the federal government and its meddling, but you also have to add in the states. And California is well known to be a big government haven, and they have countless regulations meddling in market practices. Even just the minimum wage, it prices out the poor from getting a job and the low skilled. And then you add in licensing and subsidies, monopoly privileges. It just goes on and on. And ultimately, once you squeeze, something has to give. And what gives is not the rich people who are connected with the politicians, but the most vulnerable.
Right, and that is real important, and that's how you can dissect out the differences between the states. But there are some of the things that happen that are sort of universal and affect everybody. But when you take a national statistic, we find out that real incomes have not going up, especially since 1971. Back then, the average wage was like $2. Now it's $21. But in constant dollars, guess what? There's been no increase in these 30, 40 years. And that's where the frustrations are. But guess what? All the debt and all the pumping and mischief, prices have gone up. When you destroy the currency, prices always go up faster than the standard of living and faster than the wages go up, no matter what they do. Then if they come in and say, you will pay so-and-so this much money, it distorts things even more. The market doesn't decide who should get more. So this is part of the way the federal government contributes to the problems, and adds on to all those things you've just mentioned, how the states mess things up.
Yes, and then we have to add in the Federal Reserve, as you just mentioned. Their money printing, and Silicon Valley is very close to the printing press, because overall the tech industry is one of the freest industries out of all of them. And that's where most of the change that we see in our lives over the last 20 years has been from technology. So money just pours into Silicon Valley and San Francisco and all the surrounding areas, driving up prices. So the Fed is partly responsible for that. And then you add in environmental regulations on the other end, which decreases the amount of houses that are allowed to be built. So you have government on both sides just squeezing people, and that's why we're seeing the rise in poverty. And it's hopefully someday it has to be reversed.
And it's in the interest of government to hide the poor. In the 30s, they never want to see those pictures again, people lining up and try to survive by getting handouts and getting some food. And we don't see that. But that doesn't mean there isn't a concern among the poor, because if you look at the millions who get food stamps, I mean, that is the way, is a breadline. And that sort of hides things. There's something called in economics, and many people have heard this, is being land poor. People go out and they want their land. They borrow some money and they buy the land, but they're land poor in the sense that they can't sell it very easily, and they don't have any money left over to develop the land or work the land. So they have the land, it's sitting out there, and they look like they're rich, but they really aren't. And I think this is what's happening today. It isn't so much land, but it's debt poor. People have so much debt, whether it's the government, all the boroughs and cities and states in California and other places have so much debt, and that is a great burden. So as long as they have to finance that, people are going to find out they're poor. Another way they can hide this is, let's say, the younger generation, they've pointed it out, how poor the millennials are, that they don't buy houses and they have a lot of college debt. It seems like you take a younger generation that they don't have enough jobs, paying jobs in real money, to work their way through college, which is readily available when I was going through college. It wasn't a big deal to get a few jobs and pay for your tuition. But today, what they do is if you tend not to have quite enough money and they don't want you on the streets, they give you scholarships, they loan you money, they make you more indebted, but they sort of hide these people because they're wealthy college students and it looks pretty good. They're going to get a good government college education and get a good job, which is all fiction too. And I think what we're witnessing now is the end of this coming and realization that there's no perpetual wealth in running up this debt, and there's no perpetual elimination of poverty by impoverishing the country by spending more money on programs that don't work. So I think we live in a very challenging times. I think there will be a climactic end to this. Already we're seeing the collision course on what's happening in our universities. The government is totally involved in the subsidies of the universities, and just look at the cultural Marxism which is destroying so many of the colleges and universities, and it's all a misallocation, but that adds to this social conflict. There's the social conflict between rich and poor, but what about the people who say that, well, what we need is more socialism, and some say, well, better we not just talk about socialism, we have to talk about a cultural revolution, a cultural Marxism to increase the conflict, to bring about disorder in order for them to remake society. So I think we're right at the edge of that, and because the economy has not embarked on a healthy course, and in spite of the bit of euphoria that's happening right now, I think it's still an illusion and it's still temporary, and that we eventually will have to address this. So the whole message here in California should be an awakening message for people. Why? Why is this happening? Is it true? Are the figures fudged? And yes, even in the perfectly free society, you will have poverty. There's no doubt about it. But it would be handled so differently. If you had 1 or 2% that seem to not be able to get along, families are expected to help, there still would be poverty. But if you decide that we have to take care of it, we have to make sure everybody is equal and taken care of and secure, the more you spend, guess what? If you subsidize poverty by spending more money on it, you get more of it, and that's what we're facing today.
Yes, and I'll finish up, Dr. Paul, with a plea to Californians that they have to change their idea of what government is. The problem over there is not free markets. You don't have them. The problem is not freedom. You've squashed so much of it. You've got big government, and now #1 in poverty. The purpose of government should be close to, like what John Locke, all the way back when, said, to protect our liberties. Voluntary and free interactions with people, sound money, instead of this Federal Reserve hallucinogen that is going on. And no special privileges, no monopoly privileges for certain corporations or licensing to keep out competition. That's the road that needs to be taken, not more of the same that's just going to dig a deeper hole.
Yes, and I think that's so true, and one of our big jobs is to convince enough people that it's not lack of government that is the cause of poverty. It's exactly the opposite, which is hard for people to accept because we've lived now with the Keynesian model and the progressive model for nearly 100 years, and we continue to do the same things badly, and it seems to be accelerating, but we never change our tune. And then it also invites people like a Bernie Sanders say, well, it's capitalism, it's freedom, too much poverty, and we have to do that. There are rich people and there are poor people. We have to forcibly take it from wealthy people, whether they're crony capitalists or real capitalists. If they earn the money, that's a different story than people who have made money because they're in the military-industrial complex or in the banking system, and they're ripping us off. So there's an importance for all of us to distinguish between the poverty that comes from crony capitalism and not to blame freedom for this issue. That is the challenge, and if we come around to realizing that, I think things can go in a different direction. Fortunately, I feel good about talking to young people who have at least a little crack in their minds, that have an open mind of thinking about this, because I have talked to thousands of them, and they're not like all Bernie Sanders' followers. Let me tell you that. They will follow a leader who promises them more, and they don't understand that more is less, then we won't achieve any success. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that we have a shot at this, at trying to convince the younger generation to accept something different, because we're not going to wave a wand or have the election next year change everything that's happening, and the Congress is all of a sudden going to balance the budget and restore soundness to money and restrict the Federal Reserve. That's not going to happen. Chris, I want to thank you very much today for being with us on this program.
Thanks very much, Dr. Paul.
And I want to thank all the viewers today for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.